A gatekeeper's boot struck stone. The occult researcher pressed his shoulder into a shadow and steadied the camera. Suspicion pushed him forward the way hunger pushes a man toward a locked pantry. Direct, stubborn, and without finesse. He had followed the procession through ruined alleys because 2 months of ledger requests and dead ends left a pattern where nothing official existed. He watched the hooded procession place an accused woman into the moonlit courtyard and heard the shadow magistrate's voice, low and absolute, call the court to order. The immediate conflict was plain. A tribunal was convened that refused daylight, and the problem now framed his project, reveal how judgments passed without witnesses. He had not come for spectacle, he had come for procedure. The occult researcher had spent years cataloging seals, marginalia, and the signatures habitually hidden from municipal registries. He kept his satchel under his robe and his magnifying glass tucked against his ribs. Those objects meant he worked in daylight and at archives, not behind a days of brazier heat. He now crouched with gravel grinding into his palms, counting ritual patterns with the same precision he once used to count manuscript folios. Suspicion guided his movements. Every step toward the lectern was a test of that suspicion turning into proof. A man shoved past him, dragging a torch that licked the courtyard's broken statues. The researcher keyed the camera and slid closer to the lectern. He watched the court scribe lift a ledger, banded leather and iron clasps smeared with darkened stains. The scribe's hands trembled as he opened the book, revealing lines sealed with wax, marks pressed into margins, and symbols drawn tight to substitute for eyewitness records. The researcher leaned until his breath fogged in the cold and heard the scribe mutter, "Line 12 is for the moon." He fumbled to photograph the page. His fingers left prints on stone. "Who goes there?" A voice called in the passage. The researcher flattened his back. He felt the first shift in feeling. Curiosity had sharpened into the risk of exposure. He forced his breathing to the length of a catalogue entry and eased the camera down. The gatekeeper's silhouette passed. The torchlight showed the iron signet and keys that clinked on his belt. The gatekeeper did 2 quick sweeps of the courtyard and moved on, his suspicion apparently satisfied. The ledger lay more dangerous than any knife. The lines read like a code, sealed tokens, a notation of astrological hours, and a column where the court scribe pressed a thumbprint into red wax. Evidence here did not consist of testimony. It was timing and ciphered ink. The researcher copied one image and felt, in the hollow beneath his ribs, the second emotion shift. A tremor that might have been fear. He had seen corrupt courts before, but not ones that replaced testimony with ritual timing. He drew back to the darker alcove and worked the magnifier over sketches he had made in the past month. Each mark in the ledger matched gestures he had recorded at 3 other sites. Tokens burned in hearths, brasses turned toward constellations, and judges who closed records beneath iron seals. He whispered to himself, "They do not record what happened. They record what the ritual allows." The voice was low, measured, the voice he used when cataloging. His hands moved faster. Suspicion turned to intent. He planned to prove that the court engineered scapegoats through procedure. A metal scrape announced a sudden presence. The gatekeeper doubled the patrol and stopped at the lectern. He stood over the scribe and tapped the ledger with knuckles. "Read, then bind," he ordered. The shadow magistrate's hooded head lifted from the judge's circle. His amber-brown eyes found the alcove as if sight could pierce mortar. The researcher ducked instinctively. He heard the magistrate's voice, formal and precise. "Begin." The court had begun. The researcher realized his act of observation now turned him from witness into trespasser. He slid a hand into his satchel and found the small leather-bound notebook where he'd sketched marginalia. The scribe's pen scratched like distant insects. The court scribe read aloud a sealed line and, according to the ledger, counted an astrological hour with ceremonial precision. The crowd murmured. The accused Mara held her shoulders rigid and mouthed nothing. The magistrate rose and moved to a brazier. He carried a small iron token wrapped in linen. He dipped it into ember and then let it hang in the black smoke. The researcher adjusted the lens and captured the gesture, a sudden movement. A gatekeeper rounded the corridor and saw him. The man hissed a single word and reached forward. The researcher snatched a photograph and shoved it into his satchel. Then he stepped back under a rusted archway and waited. The gatekeeper's steps stopped. The magistrate's head turned. The amber-brown gaze was a blade. The pressure of exposure pressed against the researcher like a palm on the chest. He could run, but the ledger's lines would go unrecorded in his notes. He stayed. When the gatekeeper left without sounding an alarm, the researcher exhaled and moved closer to the lectern on a new plan. He had to know the method that replaced testimony with tokens. He needed to speak with the scribe. He slipped along a corridor that smelled of smoke and iron and stopped where the scribe took a break, rubbing ink, stained palms on his robe. "You and I both know what that book is," the researcher said, keeping his voice low. The court scribe stared. "You again. Why are you here?" "Because those lines decide lives," the researcher said, "not witnesses." Lines, his words landed like a pointed tool. The scribe swallowed. "You do not understand how balance works here." He kept his fingers near the ledger even in the break. "This court binds seasons and people together. We set the hour. The hour binds guilt. You make scapegoats," the researcher said. "You pick headlines and call them verdicts." He reached into his satchel and pushed a rough sketch of the ledger across a stone basin. The scribe's lip twitched. Look, he learned more in that uneasy parley than he had hoped. The scribe moved his fingers over diagrams on the sketch and said, "Masks seconded by tokens. Seal the token. Perform the hour. The people need a culprit and the night gives them one. The magistrates give the reason." The scribe's voice did not raise. It only got smaller and more precise. The researcher heard the scribe choose words with the same care used to press wax seals. "Why at night?" The researcher asked. "Night holds fewer witnesses." The scribe replied, "Night makes the ritual less disrupted. The hour moves. The token burns." Law and Sky agree. He lifted the sketch back toward the ledger and pointed to a marginal mark. "See. This line calls for a token burned at the 7th hour of the moon. The brazier turns the token into a verdict." He tapped his ink, stained fingertips on the wood. Their exchange was cut short by the sound of a bell struck 3 times. The circle called the court to a publicization ritual, a staged proceeding where the accused listened while the magistrate performed the sealing. The researcher tried to memorize the scribe's face. Ink stained under the nails, small scars at the knuckles, a practiced trimmer near the thumb. The scribe's information changed the researcher's course. He would not only record ritual, he would attempt to take physical proof away. He slipped back to the alcove and considered options. He could wait and photograph every token drop. He could try to steal a sealed line. He chose the latter. That choice was an escalation born of a new emotion, urgency. Fear of being caught rose, but urgency dominated. His work demanded a gamble. He eased forward as the magistrate resumed and Mara stood to answer accusation. "Mara," the magistrate intoned, "you are brought before this court for the rending of oath and the misalignment of household rights." The words were ceremonial. They landed on the accused as if they were blows. Mara's voice did not break as she said, "I did not break the oath." Her hands were bound by a thin cord. The researcher watched the cords as evidence of constraint rather than truth. The magistrate tilted his head slowly and reached for a small sealed token. He held it between his iron fingers and said, "Let the hour be rid." He pronounced an incubation phrase while the scribe read the ledger line. The brazier took the token. The token burned and hissed. Ash swirled into the night. For the researcher, watching the token combust was the chapter's first major reveal. Verdict as combustion. He moved while the smoke still hid motion. He had memorized the brazier's positions and the scribe's stance. He slipped down service passages and found, behind a half-broken wall, a small storeroom where ledgers were kept before being taken into the court. He pried open a crate and found a stack of ledgers, some scorched, some pristine, bound by red thread. He picked up one ledger and felt the edge of wax on his fingertips. Someone called out in a voice he did not recognize. Footsteps moved nearer. He tucked a small scorched corner under his robe. An alarm of 2 quick knocks sounded at the inner gate. The gatekeeper's shadow filled the storeroom doorway. The researcher held his breath and tucked the ledger further under his robe, folding it to hide the scorched edge. The gatekeeper pushed past and did not look at him. The researcher exhaled and slipped into the alley. He had what he wanted. A scorched fragment that might show a sealed line. He ran through passages that smelled of damp mortar and smoke. At the edge of the courtyard, a young court scribe's apprentice tried to bar his path. The apprentice said, "Stop. Where are you going?" Away, the researcher said. He did not want to hurt the apprentice but could not allow delay. He pushed past the apprentice's reach and kept running. An hour later he reached a safe house where a single candle burned on a table. He set the fragment down and cleaned soot from the corner with trembling fingers. The fragment held a line and a half, ink that bled where it met wax, and a marginal note in a cramped hand. He moved the magnifier over the lines. The marginal note read, "Bind at 7th moon token 3. Verdict to brazier." A second note, in a different hand, had been scraped away, leaving only a roughened skin on the paper. He traced that abrasion with his fingertip and felt the third emotion shift, from urgency into grim resolve. He understood the ledger's mechanism, and he understood why the court cloaked itself in night. He tested the fragment under the candle and noticed another detail. The ledger's ink contained an additive that caught ember in a particular way, a slow smolder instead of an instant flame, leaving a trace that the magistrates read as confirmation. He set the fragment down and listened to the candle. The safe house was quiet but not safe. A knock at the outer door made him freeze. He slid the fragment into his satchel and walked to the door. "Who is it?" he asked. A voice, low and careful, answered. "A friend of records." "I bring a question." The gatekeeper parted the doorway and his keys flashed in the weak light. The researcher kept his voice steady. "What do you want?" "To know if ink that smolders can be read as truth." The gatekeeper, "We have been asked to look into missing seals." He stopped and then added, "You should not have taken that, then return it." The researcher said, "No." The gatekeeper replied, "Bring me proof first. Then perhaps no one will be burned." The gatekeeper turned and left. The researcher closed the door and sat heavily for a moment. He had a shard of ritualized lore and a courted enemy. He opened the satchel and worked the fragment under the magnifier. The scraped note suggested deliberate erasure. Someone had tried to hide an annotation that might have named a magistrate. The researcher felt rage, sharp and controlled, a fourth shift where suspicion became accusation. He wrote a note to himself in the margin of his own notebook. Find the name under the scrape. He spent the rest of the night making a careful rubbing of what remained. Each small scrape revealed half a letter that would, when combined with other fragments, identify a signature. He prepared to leave the safe house. The consequences of exposing the court had never felt theoretical. He had heard the magistrate call their hour. He had watched a verdict burn. If he published his findings, the court would hunt the source of the leak. If he stayed silent, innocent people would continue to be bound by ritual rather than testimony. He placed the rubbing into an envelope and sealed it with a strip of cloth. He counted the possible outcomes: exposure, exile, or a quiet death in a ruin. Deliberation ended when the gatekeeper's shadow filled the curtain. "The gatekeeper, you will come with me. The magistrate requests your presence." The words were not a question. The researcher had already rehearsed answers to formal summons. He had not rehearsed being taken from safe house to circle. He did not resist. He folded the rubbing into his palm and walked out into the courtyard where the brazier still smoked. The magistrate sat in the judge's circle and looked at him without surprise. "You took our ledger fragment," the magistrate said. "You witnessed our procedure." His voice had the deliberate cadence of a man closing a ledger. "I did," the researcher said. "I saw ritual that replaces testimony. I photographed the line." He kept his voice even. He felt the last emotion shift move under his ribs, fear congealing into a controlled, outward calm. He could still act, he could still speak. The magistrate tilted his head. "Why?" he asked. The researcher answered, "Because people deserve daylight trials where words matter. Because you burn tokens and call them evidence." He watched the magistrate's hands. The magistrate folded them and revealed ink, stained palms. "You take testimony and turn it into theater. You make law depend on smoke." The magistrate named Mara and gestured toward the brazier. "You have seen the brazier take a token. You have seen the scribe read. You have seen how the hour binds. What will you prove in daylight? That we acted, or that we acted with intent?" The researcher could not speak a theorem. He could show a fragment, a rubbing, a line of scraped handwriting. He produced the rubbing and the scorched fragment and set them where the magistrate could see. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. He stood and reached into his robes for a small iron signet. He turned the signet so that the court emblem flashed in the brazier light and said, "You have stolen our method. You will answer for that. 3 men moved to hold the researcher, and Mara flinched as if the motion reached her through the air. The scribe stepped forward and said, "We could burn him. It would be swift." His voice carried no cruelty. It was a ledger, like observation. The researcher heard the scribe's suggestion as a procedural option. He felt a cold clarity. The court's method included punishment options designed to silence inquiry. Then the magistrate did something unexpected. He reached into the brazier, took a sealed token from a hiding place within the coals, and unwrapped it. "We will decide differently," he said. He held the token and recited a short phrase. The token smoldered in his palm but did not burn. The magistrate looked at the researcher and then at Mara. "Bind him to observe trial and truth. If he proves true, he will publish nothing. If he breaks our balance, he will be cast." The researcher realized the magistrate had converted his act of theft into a trap, observation under constraint. A junior juror rose and asked, "Is he prisoner or witness?" The magistrate's reply was a soft, decisive line. Both. He placed the researcher's hands against a small iron band and locked it. The sound of the band snapping shut was the chapter's cliffhanger. The researcher had not expected physical restraint. He felt metal cool around his wrist, and all options narrow. They summoned witnesses. The scribe read aloud the ledger's lines, the gatekeeper demonstrated chain of custody, and Mara remained bound but defiant. The researcher had to speak during the confrontation. He stood and said, "The ledger's marginalia shows direction, not evidence. The token burns because you intend it to burn. You engineer verdict by timing and seal." His voice was steady. He wanted listeners to follow his logic. The magistrate interrupted. "You call intention a crime." The magistrate said, "What do you call making order when chaos gathers?" "Order by secret law is still lawless to the people it condemns," the researcher replied. He looked at Mara. "Mara, did anyone swear an oath against you that you recall?" he asked. Mara's jaw tightened. "No. I bound candles for my neighbor's funeral. They accused me because their hour matched the ledger's note. I begged them to ask witnesses." The gatekeeper spoke then, in a tone that surprised the researcher with its flatness. "We do not need witnesses when the hour agrees with the ledger. The people accept a ritual verdict more readily than tangled testimony." He shrugged. "It keeps the peace." The gatekeeper's phrase landed like an explanation and a justification. The researcher had to counter with fact. He produced the rubbing and held it up. "You see the scraped note. Someone attempted to erase a name. Someone wanted the ledger to hide an authorizing hand." He watched the magistrate's expression for a reaction that would change the court's stance. The magistrate looked at the scribe, and the scribe lowered his eyes. When the magistrate finally spoke, he did not deny the scrape. "Names are political. We protect the stability of the circle by removing names when needed." This answer clarified a motive the researcher had only suspected. Erasure served to shield patrons. The revelation changed the researcher's understanding of earlier events. The twist altered the entire pattern. The court did not only create scapegoats. It protected sponsors. A juror looked to the magistrate and whispered, "Do we bind him further?" The magistrate's jaw worked. He did not decide immediately. The researcher realized that the court's ritual included theatrical indecision. The pause was an instrument. In that pause, the researcher acted. He reached into his satchel, produced the photograph he had taken in the alcove, and unrolled it on the brazier's rim. The image showed the scribe's hand over a ledger line and, in the corner, a small bronze emblem covered in soot. The emblem matched the insignia on the magistrate's iron signet. The courtyard went very quiet. The researcher felt a new surge of resolve, edged with fear. This was the decisive moment where his evidence could force acknowledgement. The magistrate's voice stayed calm, but his eyes flashed. "You show an emblem that could be coincidence. Do you have proof of patronage?" he asked. "Not yet," the researcher said, "but the scraped note hides a name. If the name is one of the patrons you shield, then the ledger functions to protect sponsors while producing scapegoats." He met the magistrate's gaze. "I will find the name. If you allow me time, I will return with proof. If you do not, I will publish what I have and name the method." "The choice is yours." The magistrate considered the offer and then nodded once. He unfastened the iron band from the researcher's wrist, but left a faint red ring. "You will leave the fragment here under our custody and return in 3 nights with proof, or remain bound until you produce evidence." he said. "We will allow time because balance requires reason. We will not permit chaos." The researcher felt a complicated emotion. Relief braided with anxiety. He had gained a deadline and lost immediate freedom. They escorted him from the court and released him at the edge of the courtyard. Mara's eyes met his for a second and then turned away. The researcher walked to the safe house with the rubbing still secreted in his satchel. He had negotiated breathing room, but the magistrate's allowance came with a condition. Work under the watch of a court that now knew he could expose them. He could find the name under the scrape, or he could risk the magistrate's promise. In the safe room he opened the satchel and examined the scorched fragment once more. The scraped area gave up a ghost of a letter when he held it near the candle. He set out a pattern of rubbings and overlays and matched a partial glyph to a known patron's mark recorded in a municipal ledger 2 years prior. It was not a full name, but it shifted the burden of proof closer to the magistrate's circle. He prepared his notes and slid the rubbing back into the envelope. A thin, urgent resolve settled. He would return with the missing piece. He extinguished the candle and listened to the settled hush of the safe house. He felt the physical ache in his wrists where the iron band had been. The impression would become a reminder more specific than a slogan. He would use that reminder to drive methodical work. Follow marginalia hands, compare inks with municipal records, question the apprentice who had tried to stop him, and trace the scribe's scars back to a guild register. Each action would be a discrete, verifiable step rather than a plea. He folded his notes and set them beside the satchel. At dawn a thin light edged through the shutters and found the scorched fragment. He picked it up and watched the ash fall at his fingertips. A small flake revealed a sliver of the scraped letter. He folded the flake into his palm and heard a knock at the front door. He moved to the door and opened it to find the court scribe standing there, sleeves rolled, ink dark beneath his nails. The scribe, "You left your magnifier behind." He held it like a peace offering. The researcher took the magnifier, and in that passing exchange he realized the scribe's face had not hardened. It had a look of someone carrying a secret that made breath heavy. The chapter closed with a concrete beat. The researcher placed the magnifier on the table, slid the scorched fragment and rubbing into a drawer, and stepped outside to follow a lead the scribe's look had given him. The courtyard's moonlight had receded, but the tribunal's method remained, waiting for daylight to decide whether ritual or testimony would hold sway. He crouched against cold stone and watched a courier press a sealed bundle into a robed hand beneath the arch. Suspicion drove him forward faster than caution. He had followed a procession the way a man follows a thin, visible trail. The occult researcher kept his left hand on the strap of his satchel and his right on the magnifier cord while he counted the seconds between the courier's steps and the recipient's reply. Within those seconds he saw a quick exchange of folded parchment and a fingered sigil stamped into wax. The central problem was immediate. The court's verdicts left daylight and returned as sealed sentences, and secrecy itself functioned as the law. He moved from the arch to the annex wall in 3 measured paces. Simple facts filled his first minutes. He had spent 2 months tracking ledger entries. He carried a leather satchel of notes. And the magnifying glass had a chip on its rim from when a gatekeeper's boot struck stone in the ruined alley during his earlier tale. The cracked rim reminded him of Chapter 1's procession and pushed memory into action rather than recollection. He is mid-40s, lean, robes pressed into modern tailoring, and he keeps a small notebook where he copies marginalia verbatim. These details anchored the scene and justified his presence in the annex that night. He slipped along the annex corridor and found the low, shuttered window. Doubt arrived as a physical prick under the scalp when he expected an empty corridor and found a single candle glow within. His hands tightened on the window sill. He remembered the courier's gait, the courier's left foot catching a small tear in the cloak. Doubt shifted to alarm when he heard paper being turned twice and then rubbed hard. The occult researcher eased the window open and let his breath fog the glass for a second while he peered inside. Inside, ledgers lay on timber shelves. Someone had stacked books in a careful tilt to hide one lectern from a straight line of sight. He entered the dim chamber and the candle smell, beeswax and old ink, filled his nostrils. On the lectern a ledger lay open. Inked marginalia threaded the margins. He reached out and hesitated, feeling the surface temperature of the wood. He traced a single brown stain with a fingertip and folded back a corner to check a page number. The silent scribe looked up, eyes widening. "Who is there?" The silent scribe, voice thin and quick. The occult researcher answered with a name. "Silent scribe, I have questions about ledger entries." The scribe dropped the pen and raised both hands. The scribe's palms were ink, stained at the fingertips. Dialogue cut into the scene and revealed a human reaction. The scribe mouthed something and pointed to a seal on the open page. He repeated the gesture in slow, clear motions. Pages were added and erased after verdicts were given. The researcher leaned in. "Show me the last edition." The scribe rose and gestured to the ledger with shaking fingers. He did not speak many words, his hands did the talking. Their exchange was narrow and fast. The scribe tapped names, then covered a line. The researcher spotted a torn edge folded into the slate of the ledger, a page with a smear of red across a condemned name. They had not yet finished when 2 court enforcers hammered the outer door. The knock landed like a thrown stone. The researcher felt fear as a tightening in his jaw and a cooling sweat at the base of his neck. He moved to conceal the torn, blood-smudged folio between his notes. The scribe pushed himself toward the lectern to block the view. One enforcer opened the door and shoved a heavy boot inside. The second enforcer's torch swung a light that threw the scribe's profile sideways and revealed the ledger's open line. Tension rose. "Concrete danger arrived, hands where I can see them," a court enforcer barked. The researcher did not reply. He slipped the folio into his satchel and zipped the flap with his knee. The enforcer reached for the ledger. The scribe tried to pull his hands away. The enforcer's fingers closed on a thin parchment. He demanded, "Where did this come from?" The scribe stuttered. He urged, and then stopped, eyes down. The shadow magistrate arrived without a footfall. He stood in the doorway like a weight. The enforcers bowed their heads in quick, automatic motion. The shadow magistrate's voice was gravelly and used few words. "What is this disturbance?" he said. The researcher stepped forward and said he followed a courier magistrate. "I saw a sealed bundle passed beneath the arch." The magistrate's hands folded. He tilted his head slowly and measured the researcher. The magistrate said, "You trespass where light is forbidden." The researcher said, "Secrecy here hides changed names in ink." The magistrate's mouth tightened. The scribe broke in with one line. "They replaced lines after they left." He pointed at his palms and then toward the brazier room where judgment tokens were kept. The scribe's admission changed the room's gravity. A bargain followed quickly. The magistrate's voice dropped into ritual cadence. "Silence keeps balance," he said. The researcher, with the torn folio visible in his satchel, felt his resolve harden. Suspicion had been his entry. Doubt had arrived in the ledger's margins. Fear was tightening his limbs now. Resolve began to outline choices in his hands. The magistrate pressed, "You may leave your questions, or you may witness correction." The researcher answered, "Show me correction." They carried the scribe to the ante-room beneath the judge's dais. The corridor smelled of smoked wood and iron. The magistrate held a folded parchment in a tight fist. He produced a bundle of red thread and wound it around the ledger as if binding evidence itself. The scribe watched and did not meet the researcher's eyes. The researcher asked, "Who orders the corrections?" The scribe said, "They come at midnight. The ledger opens and names shift at dawn." He added, "We are told the seals are for the balance." His hands trembled on his knees. The researcher asked, "Who seals them?" The magistrate did not speak immediately. He set the folded parchment on the table and tapped the seal with a knuckle. The researcher moved his hand to the folio in his satchel, fingers brushing the scorch mark at the corner. He had to show the torn page to prove alteration. He slid it onto the table. When he exposed the torn folio, the scribe's reaction was immediate. The scribe lurched and grabbed the researcher's sleeve. "Take it back," the scribe hissed. The researcher said, "Speak, silent scribe. Who forced you?" The scribe's voice dropped to a handful of words. "Keys. Tokens. The brazier, they make us write what the circle requires." He tapped his ink-stained fingertips against his jaw. The arresting detail altered the power dynamic in the room. The shadow magistrate moved with a measured irritation. "You accuse the court," he said. The researcher answered, "You burn evidence in ritual. You add entries after verdicts. The magistrate slid a heavy iron signet across the table. "Then show me proof that cannot burn." He lifted a sealed token and let it rest in the brazier's light. The token's metal had a small, dark patina. The court enforcer nudged the brazier. Ash trembled in the air. An attempt to bargain turned into confession. The silent scribe was ordered to add a name that was not present at trial. The researcher pressed. A name. Which name? The scribe spoke the name, and the researcher recognized it as a merchant he had seen in daytime markets. An ordinary man with a family. The recognition was a concrete human detail that deepened outrage. The magistrate's features hardened. He reached for the sealed token and declared it symbolic and final. The researcher moved without thinking. He lunged to snatch the token from the brazier. Hands grabbed him. The shadow magistrate slapped a palm to the token and pushed it into the flame. Sparks rose and clumped like black pollen. The brazier's heat licked the researcher's fingers. He smelled hot metal and the bitter breath of burned thread. A physical struggle erupted. The researcher shoved the magistrate, and the magistrate's chain of keys clattered against stone. Court enforcers pinned the researcher by the shoulders. The scribe tried to wrench free, and the researcher's fingers closed around a token edge as it dropped from the brazier. The token hit the floor and skidded toward the brazier. The researcher dove after it. "Drop it!" the shadow magistrate roared. "Drop it now!" The court enforcer. The researcher answered. "I will not let you burn names!" The magnetism of the struggle focused on the token and the ledger fragment. Rapid lines followed. "Give it here!" "No!" "Stand back!" "Hold him!" "You lie!" The exchange comprised 5 quick lines, names punctuated sentences to anchor who spoke. The scribe shouted between them. "The ledger, look at the edge!" An enforcer slammed his knee into the researcher's ribs. He grunted and released his hold, but his hand still brushed a scorched fragment. The token caught the flame and hissed. Smoke stung the researcher's eyes and he coughed. He felt a hot grit on his palm and realized the token had spared a corner of the ledger when it fell. The ledger's fragment fell against his sleeve and stuck. He tore it free and smelled the sharp iron of blood on the paper. Fear spiked into a physical recoil. He staggered, inhaled, and then clenched his jaw. He had proof, small and burned, but legible at the edges. The shadow magistrate ordered the scribe taken. "Take him to the circle," he said, voice low. The enforcers seized the scribe. The scribe reached for the researcher as they dragged him away and hissed one last line. "You don't know what happens at dawn." The researcher's hand was numbed where the token had brushed his skin. He could see the magistrate's iron signet, the chain of keys, the magistrate's ink-stained palms. That image would remain a concrete marker. Outside, the researcher fled into narrow alleys with a scorched fragment tucked in his satchel. He ran past overturned crates and a pub with shutters closed. The gatekeeper's boot striking stone echoed in his head as a reminder of his earlier pursuit through ruined alleys. He leaned against a wall and pressed the fragment to a candle in his safe house. He held the magnifier over the edges, and then, slowly, the pattern revealed itself. A cipher tied to names erased at dawn, a set of repeating sigil strokes that matched several sealed tokens he had catalogued. He worked by a single candle. His hands trembled but did not stop. The emotion in his limbs changed from fear to determination expressed through precise action, rubbing, copying, comparing. He traced the sigil pattern and matched it to a ledger entry that had been folded and re-inked. The revelation was concrete. The court manufactured evidence after verdicts to maintain a sealed narrative. That discovery shifted the researcher's purpose in a single, tangible movement. He folded the fragment into a protective scrap and tied it with wax. He wrote a name in his notebook and underlined it twice. His breathing was measured now. He compiled a list of people whose names had shifted at dawn. He pictured the merchant and 3 other names. The researcher's mind arranged choices. He could expose this with witnesses, or he'd print copies and leave them in public places. He did neither immediately. He set a plan in motion instead. He hid the fragment in his satchel, wrapped the magnifying glass in cloth, and took one last look at the candle flame. At that moment, there was a sound at the door. A key turned in the outer lock. It was not an arrival of friends. The twist came from the other side of his thin door. Someone else had anticipated his move. He slid the satchel under the bed and eased the candle lower. The outer key clicked twice. The chapter closes on a concrete action. He slid the scorched fragment into the satchel, zipped it, and heard the outer key turn. The immediate confrontation had ended with the scribe seized and the token partially consumed by flame, but the ledger's pattern remained in his hand. He knew the court would not let the matter rest. Emotion root. Suspicion had driven the beginning and threaded every choice. Emotion shifts moved through doubt, fear, and a hardening resolve shown by tightened hands, hurried copying, and the decision to hide the fragment. The chapter's mini-conflict, the exposure of post-verdict ledger manipulation, resolved in that the researcher escaped with a concrete piece of evidence and a plan, while the scribe was taken and the court retained most of its ritual power. The last line of this chapter is not reflection but a sound, the outer key turning, a physical cue that forces the next decision. A gloved hand set a small carved token down and the sound of stone met wood like a verdict. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's jaw. He pressed his shoulder into the damp niche and watched the attendants move. He had followed the procession 2 months earlier when a courier pressed a sealed bundle into a robed hand beneath an arch, and that memory sharpened his purpose now. He kept his breath measured and his left hand on the strap of his satchel, while the token sat on the slab and marked someone for nocturnal judgment. He crept farther into the record's antechamber. Suspicion was the root of his motion. Every choice he made in those corridors was an attempt to prove what his ledger fragments hinted at. The chamber smelled of stone dust and beeswax. Candles guttered in iron sconces and a narrow table held boxes of carved tokens, each set on felt. He moved his hand to the seat of one box and felt the lacquered edge of a token between his fingers, cold and carved with a sigil that matched an inked page he'd stolen earlier. A night attendant set another token on the slab and straightened. The occult researcher slid behind a pillar and felt the rough mortar against his coat. He checked the satchel at his hip. Inside were torn ledger pages and an antique magnifying glass, the latter catching a sliver of flame and throwing it as a thin bar of light. He needed the ledger entry that named the token's bearer. He could see the mechanism making the court's erasure operative tonight. He moved when one attendant left the slab. His boots were silent on the flagstones. He reached the lectern and crouched to watch a clerk unlatch a ledger. The clerk lifted a brass weight and opened the book. The page trembled under the clerk's ink-stained finger. The researcher saw names written in dense hand and a smear where a seal had been pressed. The clerk traced a condemned name with a fingernail, and the page yielded a faint brown ring where wax had been stripped. That name again, the clerk said without turning. Third time this moon, the clerk's voice was flat and procedural. The occult researcher stayed low and felt his pulse oscillate against his ribs. He had seen ledger marginalia before. This was different. Numbers sat underlined in a cipher he had not yet cracked. The shadow magistrate stood at the doorway, hood heavy, silhouette carved from the dark. The magistrate's presence made the ledger's significance dangerous in an instant. The researcher slid his hand into the satchel and found the torn page he had tucked there 2 nights before, the one with a note in the margin. Tokens bind memory. He pressed the fragment to his palm. Doubt flickered. Was a single token truly the mechanism that forbade witnesses? He felt the shift from suspicion to concern as the magistrate lifted a ringed hand and alerted a guard. He had to act. He leaned forward and tore a thin page edge free from the ledger as the clerk moved the book. The sound was the softest paper scrape. A guard turned. Footsteps accelerated in a pattern he knew from the gatekeeper's boot that had struck stone 2 chapters back. The occult researcher bolted with the page pressed to his chest. A brazier guard blocked a corridor and reached for him. The researcher shoved past, knocking a sconce. Flame flickered across his face. He ran through dark passages that smelled of wet mortar and old rope. He heard the shadow magistrate's gravelly voice calling his name in a cadence the researcher had heard once before when a courier had been accused. Stop him. Keep the tokens intact. The chase ended when he slid through a narrow escape hatch and tumbled into an alley. He doubled over and breathed like a man who had been underwater. The torn page in his hand had a single line of marginalia legible. Replacements index. Binding clause. He clutched that word, replacements, and the name beneath it. He carried the fragment to an abandoned scriptorium behind a shuttered chapel. Alina, the court scribe, waited at a table that held powdered ink, a quill, and a single candle. Her hands were ink, stained and precise when she took the fragment. The researcher set the torn page on the wood and watched her tilt the candle to the margin. Alina, read aloud, "Tokens bind memory, not just guilt. They replace remembrance with silence." She sounded the words as if cataloguing a manuscript entry, not a threat. Her manner was calm, but her fingers tightened on the quill. "Look here," she said, pointing to cramped marginalia that ran like a ledger of names. He leaned in. The researcher felt fear crawl up his throat now that doubt had yielded to alarm. He had suspected procedural secrecy. He had not suspected systematic erasure of lineage. Alina traced a line with a fingertip and narrated, "This column lists replacements. Where a name is struck, a replacement is recorded differently depending on token type." Her voice fell. "Here, see, this index marks a name connected to your family." He flinched and dropped his hand to the satchel. He had kept his history quiet. The ledger named a woman, a surname the researcher recognized from a photograph in his satchel. A grandmother he had only glimpsed once in a faded portrait. The scribe read the line again and whispered, "They plan to excise bloodlines, not merely punish individuals." The words struck him physically. Alina looked up and met his eyes. "We cannot leave this in the dark. This is not law. It is erasure." Her voice held a hard edge. "If they burn that token in the brazier, the ledger will be cleansed and witness memory will falter. The town will forget entirely." She pushed a bottle of diluted ink toward him and closed her hand on the fragment as if sealing a wound. They argued about risk and sacrifice while the candle burned low. The researcher set facts on the table. "If we remove the token before it touches flame, we can stop a binding." He counted days on his fingers. "I tracked the procession. The next casting is at midnight in the judge's circle. I watched a courier press a sealed bundle 2 months ago. That is when the ledger first shifted." Alina's reply was quick. "You put yourself in the vault. You will not take this alone." She stood, pacing across scattered folios. Her voice tightened in a way that made his hands clench. "If I go with you, I lose my cover. If you go alone, you risk capture and the ledger remains intact." She stopped and said, "There is risk either way. We must choose which names we save." The exchange tightened into an argument of 3 rapid lines. "Alina, I have a plan," he said. "You cut the clerk's cord and I fetch the token. You run the page to the cafe by the northern pier. If we fail, you keep mentioning a cafe and a pier." Alina replied, "Say the words plainly." "If we fail, I take the ledger to someone outside the court's reach." "Yes," he said. "I will return with the token or not at all." They prepared. Alina coated a scrap of cloth with lamp oil and set it aside. The researcher wrapped the torn page in waxed linen and slid the magnifying glass into his pocket. He settled his robe and the leather satchel. They left the scriptorium at 11:55 and threaded across roofs to the judge's circle. They arrived when the magistrates had already formed a ring. Torches burned at intervals and a central brazier smoked. The shadow magistrate stood at the head, heavier in silhouette than earlier in the doorway, and balanced a sealed token on the iron tongs. A brazier guard passed a hand over his face and spat into the flame. The researcher felt resolve harden in his chest. Resolve replaced fear as his immediate driver. They moved like thieves. Alina slipped to the dais and knelt near a clerk who arranged books. The researcher climbed the outer ring on cold stone and met a brazier guard with his shoulder. Guards turned slowly. He felt his palms sweat. The shadow magistrate's gravelly voice cut the air. Present the binding. He used the magistrate's name once more in his head, and it sapped him. The magistrate dropped the token into the brazier and ash rose in a short salt of heat. The researcher lunged. He reached for the tongs. A brazier guard seized his wrist and the iron ring at the magistrate's hand flashed in the half-light. Alina grabbed the token with a sleeve soaked in oil and tried to wrench it free. "Let go," the magistrate said. His voice had the court's authority. "You would undo balance. You would spare the guilty and damage the just." His hand moved like a judge weighing scales. Alina jerked back. "The court kills memory, not guilt." She snapped. "Alina will not watch children be erased." Her voice broke and she had to step back. The researcher twisted, bringing his shoulder down against the guard's grip. He gripped the token and felt the lacquer give under his fingertips. A brazier guard struck him with the butt of a halberd. Pain flared along his temple where a scar throbbed faintly. The researcher heard air leave his lungs and then the sharp, small sound of the token leaving his fingers. He staggered and Alina lunged. They had 3 quick exchanges. The guard shouted, the magistrate commanded, Alina cursed and pulled. The token slipped between them and hit the brazier rim. The rim glowed. Sparks speared up into the night, and a thin ring of ash blew over a clerk's ledger. For a moment the ritual faltered. The magistrate's mouth opened and words formed that might have completed the binding. Alina, with both hands at the token, yelled, "Now!" and grabbed the tongs. The brazier guard shoved her. She lost purchase and the token fell with a small hard clink into the brazier's burn. They beat against one another in a single violent collapse of bodies. The researcher felt fingers in his collar and the world reduced to heat and metal. He twisted and shoved a brazier guard into the magistrate's knee. The magistrate swore and a chain of small keys at his belt chimed. In the struggle, the brazier's ember caught a scrap of Alina's sleeve and a flare licked her wrist. She screamed. The sound cut clean through the ring of judges. The magistrate intoned a phrase the researcher had only read in a marginal note. It was the court's formula. A ring of steam rose and a ledger on the dais smoked. The researcher seized the token's charred edge and felt the heat bite his fingers. He tasted copper on his tongue. Then a guard clubbed the researcher's shoulder and he dropped to the floor. Alina yanked him by the collar and they rolled out through a side door as the magistrate's voice swelled into the ceremony again. They tumbled into the ruined courtyard, cuffing. Embers winked in the snow of falling ash. They ran through alleys, their lungs burning from smoke and cold. They reached a side passage at dawn and pressed themselves against a wall. The researcher counted breaths. The damage was immediate and concrete. The ledger pages at the judge's bench were scorched in a ragged crescent, and a clerk's marginalia had been smudged beyond legibility. They had interrupted the rite, but not before it took a toll. Alina unwrapped her sleeve. Her wrist was reddened and a thin line of ash stained the skin. She examined the scorched token in the researcher's palm. It was blackened and half molten, but the sigil still lay visible. The bit of the ledger they had saved was singed along one edge, and the ink along another column had bled into the paper. The researcher sat and rubbed his temple where the guard had hit him. The scar at his left temple throbbed. He felt hollow in a way that was not only physical. Back in his locked study, he laid the scorched fragment on a cloth and read the marginalia again. The name it had targeted sat intact on the page, but nearby entries had vanished. Tape and pasted slips had been removed. He held the magnifying glass to a faint new mark in the margin, a sigil scratched small and hurriedly. It resembled the ring on the shadow magistrate's finger. The researcher touched the mark with one fingertip and felt the papery ridge. An emotion moved through him, a change from resolve to dread. Alina paced and counted off consequences. They have begun marking people, she said. Not all tokens are equal. That mark is recent. The magistrate's iron ring is the same maker's stamp. She stopped and met his eyes. This is now about survival, not only exposure. Her voice held a new steadiness. He nodded and wrapped the fragment in linen. He placed it inside a locked box and set the box under a floorboard beneath his study desk. He closed the board with a flat, deliberate motion and took 3 even breaths. The final beat of the chapter is not reflection but an action. He hears a soft, deliberate knock at his door. 3 beats and a pause, then 2 more knocks. He pressed his ear to the wood before answering. The knocks resolved into a presence at the threshold. The chapter ends with that concrete moment rather than a speech of intent. He clenches the key in his hand and moves to the door. The events in this chapter advance, the ledger thread first seen in the gatekeeper's boot, and the courier's sealed bundle, and they convert the researcher's mission from proof to prevention. The brazier action resolves the immediate conflict of the chapter. The token is cast and the ritual interrupted, but the court's mechanism remains active and personal. The last action, the knock at the door, ties directly to the scorched fragment and forces the next choice. He lunged across the raised lectern and snatched the sealed token while robed judges slammed the circle shut. Suspicion drove his hands. Suspicion threaded the whole motion from shoulder to fingertip and dictated every risk he took that night. The researcher felt the token's cold iron bite through his glove and heard a court attendant bark an alarm as feet pounded the stone. The immediate problem cut clear. Expose the ledger's ties to the city's patrons or be beaten down and watch the evidence burn. He shoved the token into his satchel and kept moving. He was mid-40s, lean, and kept his satchel against his chest with one arm as he fought toward the service passage. The reader had chased this tribunal for 2 months. A gatekeeper's boot striking stone at the archway, a courier pressing a sealed bundle into a robed hand beneath the arch, and a gloved palm setting a small carved token down on the brazier months earlier. Those concrete events sat under his skin the way a bruise sits under the surface, and they had fed his suspicion into a plan with small, precise risks. He had not come to revenge, he had come to prove a circuit of favors and protective sentences. The first man who moved to stop him was an attendant with a torch. "Stop." The attendant shouted, "Seal him." The voice was low and brisk. The researcher shoved the lectern with both hands, toppling a stack of wax, sealed folios. A page slid free and caught fire along the lectern edge. He tore the burning paper free with quick, practiced motions and jammed it into his satchel beside the token. His jaw tightened, his breath was loud in his ears. Doubt surfaced for a second. If he failed, who else would pay? And he answered it with speed, not thought. They dragged him back into the circle. The shadow magistrate stepped forward and lifted both hands. He wore heavy ceremonial robes that swallowed the torchlight and a hood that threw his jaw into shadow. "You breach the court," the magistrate, each syllable slow and measured. "You will face the court." His voice had the gravel of smoked wood and the precision of a man who had spent years weighing ink, stained scales. The researcher did not stand quiet. He held up a scorched folio fragment between 2 trembling fingers and said, "This ledger records names. The sentences bind families, not criminals. You take payment, and you write protection into ritual language." The room tightened around the statement. Suspicion shifted into anger at the magistrate's control. The researcher gripped the fragment until his knuckle whitened. "Shadow magistrate." He repeated, using the man's title like a physical object. "You call this balance. You sell immunity." The magistrate inclined his head and did not answer immediately. The court clerk, thin pale with ink, creased thumbs, moved behind the magistrate and kept his hands folded as if holding a secret. The researcher watched the clerk's fingers. A man who had pressed a sealed bundle into a robed hand weeks earlier would carry guilt on his nails. This clerk carried it on his posture. "You cannot show those pages here." The magistrate finally, "You cannot tear open a sacred order within these walls." His hands folded in front of him. The attendants advanced, making a small, coordinated net. The accused sat on a low stool, hands bound, eyes fixed on the researcher with a look that was not pleading so much as exhausted. The accused mouthed a name, but the researcher could not make the sound out over the clatter. The researcher pushed his satchel toward the lectern and forced the ledger open on the table with one elbow. The pages smoked where earlier flames had licked them. He read aloud the marginalia that had been scrawled in a hurried hand. Names of guildmasters, of an alderman, of a merchant whose ships had emptied the docks and left families unmoored. Each name had a small notation and a sum, payment acknowledgement for judicial maintenance. He read, protections assigned and rituals recorded. The clerk made a small sound, half choking, and the magistrate's expression briefly shifted. The room moved in reaction, shock, calculation, the precise mathematics of power. Doubt arrived next. The researcher saw it in the magistrate's eyes. Not fear, but the faint, surprised sting of a man who found his ledger opened without permission. The researcher felt the shift in the room's weight. Some attendants reached for the chain of keys at the magistrate's hip. The researcher lifted a finger and pointed at a page. "You wrote a phrase here that bends law into obedience," he said. "You wrote that a name, once sealed, binds kin into silence. You make verdicts that haunt houses for generations." He called out one of the city notables by name. A ripple crossed the bench where lesser judges sat. Some lowered their heads. One folded his hands and did not look away. 3 attendants moved as one toward the brazier. The shadow magistrate cut them off with a single sign. He unfastened the iron signet at his finger with calm, deliberate fingers and held it up. "The court preserves balance," he said. "Some truths must be kept from daylight to prevent greater harm." The researcher heard how prepared the line was. He had listened for it in ledgers and in the courier's hurried breathing. He answered with the ledger's marginalia, balance. You hide bribes under the guise of ritual. You protect the powerful and leave the poor to burn." His voice had a rasp now. Anger drove his next motion. He slipped his hand unsteadily into his satchel, but instead of withdrawing a page, he pulled out the magistrate's signet, held it up, and then flung it toward the brazier. The signet struck metal and dropped into the brazier's coals. Sparks spidered upward and a smell of scorched iron and old oil filled the chamber. The magistrate's face changed in a breath, shock, then a ceremonial fury. He spun toward the brazier and began a sealing invocation, a string of syllables that tightened the hair at the nape of a listener's neck. The researcher had planned to interrupt a ritual. He had not planned the sound that followed. The invocation pushed against the air and the signet flared with a sudden, low light. The brazier roared as if fed a sudden current. Heat hit faces. Robes snapped out from bodies. An attendant shouted to dampen the flames. Another tried to smother a burning folio. That moment became the chapter's physical cliff. A sharp, violent rupture where ritual and material objects collided. A bench toppled, the lectern split along its grain, the accused scrambled from his stool and lunged for the researcher. "Hold." The accused cried, "Hold him." A rapid exchange of short lines followed between the researcher, the accused, the clerk, and the magistrate, each line under 10 words. Each line another small swing of the room's balance. "The ledger is false." The magistrate, "You keep names and payments." The researcher shot back, "You stole our token." An attendant said, "You hide verdicts for coin," the researcher said. "You will answer." The magistrate, "You will answer the ledger," the researcher said. The rapid back and forth lasted only seconds but rearranged alliances. The court clerk, who had kept his hands folded like an offering, suddenly moved forward. He caught the researcher's arm and whispered something in a tight voice. "Listen." The clerk said, his thumb hiding a folded parchment. There was an oath. "They forced us." The clerk's hands trembled enough to expose ink on his fingertips. He pushed the folded parchment into the researcher's open palm. "This binds us," the clerk said. "We swore to accept sentences in exchange for protection from men outside these walls. I cannot say more without dying a family's safety." The researcher read the words. Signatures, seals, a name written in a hand he recognized from the marginalia. That moment shifted suspicion into uncertainty. The clerk's testimony introduced a new fact. The judges themselves had been forced, bound by a separate, older compact. The researcher felt the room tilt again under a different axis of blame. He heard the accused speak, voice crude with exhaustion. "I signed nothing. They did it to me while I slept." The accused's mouth worked. His face had the raw lines of someone who had been punished more by endurance than by any single blow. The accused pressed forward, then stopped as attendants reached for him. The magistrate barked an order and several attendants seized the clerk by the shoulders. The clerk did not fight. He had already exposed himself with the parchment. "You swore before me." The magistrate to the clerk, voice low and controlled. "You swore to keep the order. You will not undo it here." The researcher shoved his elbow between the magistrate and the clerk and read aloud the oath's first clause. "Judges shall maintain secrecy when asked by the Council of Names under penalty of lineage forfeiture." He named 2 individuals listed in the oath. "This is not balance," he said. "This is a protection racket written into ritual law." The accused added, "They signed my name while I slept." That sentence landed like a physical blow. A new emotional shift moved through the researcher, from anger to a cold, meticulous clarity. He held the clerk's folded parchment and felt responsibility press on his shoulders differently. If the oath bound judges under threat to family, exposing it would unmoor people who had relied on the court's secrecy for survival. The researcher had wanted exposure. Now he recognized the cost. He could see the faces of those whose names were scrawled in margins. He could imagine fathers and mothers dragged into suspicion if he announced those names publicly. He made a decision in action. He tore 2 pages from the ledger with deliberate fingers and shoved the half-charred fragments into his jacket. Then he took the folded parchment back and smoothed it on the lectern with a palm. "You will not burn this without testimony," he said to the magistrate. "Bring those listed in the oath into the circle. Let each judge explain." The magistrate's jaw worked. He inhaled, then signaled an attendant. "Lock the passages," he ordered. "No one leaves until this is settled." The attendants closed the service doors, metal clattering into place. Outside the circle, a murmur began. The accused shouted the name of a minor official who had appeared in the ledger. The magistrate's eyes flicked to the clerk, who lowered his head and avoided meeting the researcher's gaze. The researcher watched the clerk's shoulders. The clerk had the look of a man who had tried to shield his family with silence and failed. The researcher leaned toward him. "Name one protector," he said quietly. "Say the name now." The clerk's lips moved. "Alderman Joran," he breathed. The name landed heavy in the chamber. Several judges flinched, and one overturned a small ink bottle in his haste. An unexpected reveal followed. One of the bench judges, a portly man with a thin, angry mouth, rose and spat in the direction of the magistrate. "You made a sign for fear of harm," he said. "You protected your own while my daughter froze in a blind alley." The portly judge's voice was raw and immediate. A second judge, younger, with a scarred knuckle, began to speak in the same quick, full of rage cadence. "We were threatened. We were shown what they could do to kin outside these walls." The room complicated. Allies rearranged. The accusation that had once sat squarely on the magistrate spread like ink in water. Confrontation escalated. The magistrate reached for a folded bundle at his belt and unrolled it. Inside were small iron keys and a sealed token identical to the one the researcher had thrown. "These tokens bind verdicts." The magistrate. "They are instruments of the order." The researcher stepped forward and pointed to the brazier where ash and a half melted signet lay. "You force seals to be cast, and you call them cosmic law," he said. "You assign names and call them covenant. You are accountable." A younger attendant made a move to restrain the researcher. The accused lunged instead and struck the attendant with the flat of his palm. The attendant staggered. The peak of the night came with the final physical rupture. As the magistrate began another short sealing phrase, the researcher reached down, grabbed the magistrate's iron signet from the brazier ashes, and flung it into the brazier a second time, this time driving it down into glowing coal. The magnet of ritual pressure reversed, and the signet's swallow of heat produced a wrenching sound. A high, tearing note that ran through the chamber. The clerk's parchments fluttered. The brazier's flames leaped, then recoiled. The magistrate convulsed as if struck by a blow. His robes tore along a seam as he fell to his knees. The room went silent except for the rasp of the magistrate's breath and the crackle of burning embers. Several attendants rushed to bind him. The clerk dropped onto his knees and pressed both palms to the floor, breathing hard. The accused staggered forward and placed his hand over the magistrate's chest. "No," he said, "we do not kill him. We do not make him a martyr by blood." The researcher watched the man, his accused, to see what he would do. The accused's voice was small and clear. "I do not want his death. I want the names free. I want children not to be asked to pay for sentences." That plea changed the dynamic in the room. The wounded magistrate lay panting, the attendant split between furious and hesitant. The researcher had one last, decisive choice. He could have shouted the ledger's names into the open hall. Or he could extract a legal knot from within the court without triggering the exposure that would ruin innocent kin. He chose a middle path that required trust he had not yet earned. He turned to the clerk and spoke firmly. "We will take the ledger fragments and the oath. We will take them to the city notary who cannot be bought by aldermen. We will demand a public review. I will not publish names in taverns or street cries. I will take them to lawful, visible authority and force them to act." The clerk's hands trembled so hard the parchment flopped on the lectern. "Will they act?" The clerk whispered. "If the notary is bound, we will have nothing left." The researcher met his eyes. "If the notary runs, we will have at least tried," he said. Escape followed in the next 15 minutes. Attendants argued over whether to detain the researcher, to drag him naked through the court as a warning, or to let the wounded magistrate be carted away for healing and public pity. The researcher slipped through a service passage as attendants argued. At the threshold, a young attendant, one who had only minutes earlier cast his torch to heighten the ritual, grabbed the researcher's sleeve. "You keep us from the light." The attendant spat. "You will bring ruin." The researcher pushed past him, clutching the scorched fragments. The attendant struck out and missed. Outside the service passage, the researcher ran through ruined corridors toward the safe room, the city's chill air like a blade as dawn crept along the rooftops. In the safe room, he set a single candle on the table and dumped the fragments across it. The pages smoked and curled in the candlelight. Names bled into ink, streaks. He set the folded oath next to the fragments. He sat for a long minute and counted aloud the names he still had in legible script. Those names were not just ink, they were families. He felt a new emotion settle, responsibility in place of fury. He had shifted from suspicion to anger to doubt to resolve. He lowered his hands into his lap, fingers still stained with soot and old wax. He made plans in small, concrete motions. He wrote a list. The city notary, the alderman Joran, the portly judge, the young scarred judge, a safe messenger to carry a copy. He wrapped the fragile fragments in oiled cloth and tucked them into the satchel. He placed the oath inside his inner coat. He tested the lock on the safe room door. He did not speak of destiny or fate. He spoke aloud a single, practical decision. We will take this to the notary at first light. The candle guttered and the researcher tapped ashes from a burnt edge onto the table. He remembered the gatekeeper's boots striking the arch and the courier pressing a sealed bundle into a robed hand. Those memories were concrete beats in his investigation. He used them to trace routes and predict who might move next. He planned the route. A back alley to avoid the magistrate's men, a baker he trusted at dawn who would hide a package, and a notary's office 2 streets over where the clerk's cousin worked as a scribe. He folded the satchel and slung it over his shoulder. Before he left, he looked down at the magistrate's ink, stained fingertips. He could have left the man for the dogs, but the accused and the clerk had chosen a course that avoided blood. The researcher took a strip of linen from his satchel and bandaged the magistrate's torn sleeve where it had been cut in the fall. It was a small, concrete mercy, not an absolution. The researcher tidied the lectern's scattered folios with his free hand and set the remaining pieces in a place where a neutral attendant could find them. He locked the safe room and slid out into the city alley where dawn washed the stones with thin, grey light. Outside, the city smelled of coals and wet straw. He walked with the satchel at his hip and the oath against his heart. The ledger fragments fit like broken teeth in a jaw. They did not make a hole, but they made enough. He had not ended the order that night. The magistrate survived the punishment of the brazier and lay in the court's lower chamber, breathing through a cloth and bound by attendants. The clerk had given him an opening that might free judges from forced oaths. The accused walked free for the first time in seasons. His hands bled slightly where ropes had bitten, but his step was not that of a defeated man. The researcher turned a corner and closed his eyes for a single beat to test the ache in his shoulders. He tasted ash on his lips and felt the satchel's strap rub at his shoulder. He felt the rest of the city's morning begin to stir. A cart's wheel, a dog barking, a vendor raising a cloth. He moved toward the notary's office with firm, short steps. He had shifted from an investigator hunting a secret to a man with a judicial plan. He would not shout every name in the street. He would force the matter into daylight with witnesses, records, and a notary's seal. As he approached the notary's door, a shadow peeled off the lintel. The portly judge from the bench stood there with his cloak over one shoulder. He did not speak for a long beat, then he said, "You did what I could not." His voice had an exhausted edge. The researcher looked at him. The researcher said, "What will you give as testimony?" The portly judge rubbed his thumb along a seam in his cloak and said, "I will sign an account. I will sign a statement and swear before the notary. I owe my daughter that much." That unexpected pledge was a twist the researcher had not anticipated. A judge willing to turn against a system that had kept him alive but had cost his child. They walked together toward the notary, the researcher carrying the satchel, and the portly judge carrying the old weight of a career. The clerk's folded oath sat safe in the researcher's inner coat. The accused followed at a short distance with the clerk, who moved slower now but whose shoulders had the small looseness of a man who had just admitted something heavy and therefore felt slightly lighter. The city opened in front of them as a sequence of practical tasks. Find a notary, secure witnesses, file sworn statements, and force the city magistrates to respond. They had not eradicated the secret tribunal in one night. They had, however, cracked open the mechanism. The brazier had consumed one signet and left iron and ash. The ledger had lost several pages but kept its core. The researcher recognized what remained. The council of names would not vanish because one ledger traveled to a notary. Power networked through families and guilds. It required deliberate civic work to root out. He stepped up the notary's stone step and put his hand on the door. At that instant, a soft, precise knock sounded on the safe room door behind them in the court. The researcher felt the sound almost as a physical echo. He knew who would be at that door. Another attendant, a courier, or an official come to fetch the magistrate. He also knew what it meant. The city would respond, in some way, to the fractures they had made. He opened the notary's door and walked into a room lined with scrolls and a man who looked up from his ledger with an expression that measured risk and opportunity. The researcher set the scorched fragments and the folded oath on the notary's table and spoke in a voice that dropped into the room like a weight. "I bring evidence," he said, "and witnesses." The notary's pen paused. The city had begun to pivot on a small, concrete hing, a lawyer's quill, a signed page, and the slow machinery of visible law. The researcher closed the satchel fast and waited for the notary to speak. Feeling the candle smoke still in his hair and the memory of a torn robe pressing at the back of his mind, he closed the scorched ledger and pushed the single candle toward the window as a low knock sounded at the safe room door.